Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Abdul Hamid Fazili, the Professor and Chairman of the Department, Professor Abdul Majid Khan, Director of Academics and Research Studies, Dr. Bilal Ahmed Kuti, Associate Professor, and other members of the faculty of the Department of Islamic Studies for their support in organizing and hosting today's event. As was said, I am Dr. Saad Ismail from the Department of Physiology at the Medical College at AMU, but I'm also the founder and director of Project Noon, a forum for raising academic literacy on Hindu-Muslim relations. Allow me to introduce our guest lecturer for today. Dr. Ankur Barua is University Senior Lecturer in Hindu Studies at Cambridge University. After a BSc in Physics from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, he read Theology and Religious Studies at the Faculty of Divinity, University of Cambridge. His primary research interests are Vedantic Hindu philosophical theology and Indo-Islamic styles of sociality. He researches the conceptual constellations and the social structures of Hindu traditions, both in pre-modern contexts in South Asia and in colonial milieus where multiple ideas of Hindu identity were configured along transnational circuits between India, Britain, Europe, and the USA. Some of these narratives are reimagined in his work of historical fiction. An integral dimension of Dr. Barua's research is the comparative philosophy of religion. He studies the philosophical, theological, and the socio-political aspects of Hindu-Christian engagements. In recent years, his research focus has moved to an exploration of the intersections between the idioms of bhakti, yoga, tawheed, and tasawwuf on the multiply stratified post-colonial landscapes of South Asia. Now, apart from this formal introduction, I would like to say a few words about my own experience working with Dr. Barua. While I had known of Dr. Ankur Barua since a few years, it was not until the publication of his widely circulated essay, Images of the Unimaginable God, published in Renovatio, the Journal of Zaytuna College, in April 2023, that prompted me to invite him for a discussion on our podcast. Since then, we have had further discussions and conducted webinars on themes of Hindu-Muslim relations. And this we have done in support and with the collaboration of the Cambridge Interfaith Program at the University of Cambridge, where we also organized a 10-part online lecture series or a workshop led by Dr. Ankur Barua during August 2023, which introduced Hindu socio-religious traditions and contextualized them for an Abrahamic and Islamic audience. You can find some of these recordings on our website at projectnoon.in, which also features some essays, lyrical reflections, and short fiction by Dr. Barua. My association with Dr. Barua also extends to a visiting scholarship that I was granted to visit the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge upon Dr. Barua's invitation in May 2024 to explore modalities of interreligious studies and networks in the UK. When I learned of Dr. Barua's recent travels to India, I suggested the idea of a talk at AMU, which he not only happily accepted, but has graciously self-sponsored his trip to be with us today. Now, allow me to also briefly introduce our convener and discussant, Professor Abdul Majid Khan, without whose generous time and keen enthusiasm, today's event would not have been possible. Professor Khan first obtained a BSc in Bioscience from the University of Kashmir before making the transition to an academic career in Islamic studies. He did his master's and doctorate in Islamic studies at the University of Kashmir and Aligarh Muslim University, respectively. He has been teaching at the Department of Islamic Studies here over a span of almost 3 decades since 1998. Professor Khan specializes in Quranic studies, Islam and politics, and contemporary Islamic thought. His doctoral thesis critically analyzes Muhammad Asad's translation of the Quran. Professor Khan is a polyglot, proficient in English, Urdu, Hindi, Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. He currently serves as the Director of Academics and Research Studies and is an active member of several academic bodies within the department. He has authored 4 books: Contemporary Islamic Responses to Western Impact, Muhammad Asad's Contributions to Islamic Thought, and Contemporary Human Issues from an Islamic Perspective. Additionally, he has translated works on Hinduism into Urdu and has penned numerous book chapters, research articles, and papers on Islamic political thought, culture, Sufism, Quranic studies, and Muslim responses to the West and Muslim minorities. He has presented various lectures globally in countries such as Qatar, Turkey, Bangladesh, and Thailand. With these introductory comments, I now invite Dr. Barua to deliver his guest lecture. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to all the powers, spiritual as well as temporal, sacred as well as secular, that have made this event possible. I thank the Department of Islamic Studies for being my hosts, and Dr. Saad Ismail for being our, as it were, messenger and mediator. Now, I thought initially that I would give 2 lectures. The second lecture could not be organized because of some time-tabling problems. The first lecture is the one I'm going to give you now on the problem of the insider and the outsider in the study of religions. And the second lecture would have been the particular application of this problem to Hindu-Muslim relations. So what I have done is that I've taken some material from the second lecture and put it in the first lecture. And I'm going to speak for around 55 minutes to 1 hour. I say this slightly hesitantly because I myself don't like to sit through very long lectures, but I hope I will not make you too bored or tired, and there will be some slides to go along. Now, for many years, I wished to spend some time at Aligarh Muslim University. I spent a lot of time studying history, and in particular, the history of religious traditions in South Asia. In fact, the title of my first novel is The Harvest of Time. So let me begin on a historical note and say that for around 10 years, I have been connected with St. Stephen's College in Delhi, and that institution, as it so happens, is a sister institution of AMU insofar as they are both modeled on Cambridge, which is where I am based. Now, my job description at Cambridge is senior lecturer in Hindu studies, and I try to live up to that description. That is to say, I primarily study texts and traditions rooted in scriptures such as the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bhagavata Purana, and so on. At the same time, a central component of my research involves the study from some theological and sociological perspectives of Hindu-Christian relations, and increasingly in recent years of Hindu-Muslim relations. Now, one of the great ironies of our shared post-colonial situation in South Asia is that while on the one hand, South Asia is said to be the home of spirituality, for better or worse, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, on the other hand, there are very few institutions where religion is discussed in a historically informed manner that does not directly require religious affiliation. And what do I mean by that? If you want to learn about Hinduism, you may have to go to a Hindu place or a Hindu institution which is only concerned with making this declaration: Hinduism is the greatest thing ever. Likewise, if you want to learn about Islam, you may have to go to a particular Islamic institution which is only concerned with making this declaration: Islam is the greatest thing ever. Now, there is no problem per se with such institutions. I would even say that we need such institutions where a scripture-rooted perspective is articulated, developed, and defended. However, what if someone who is Muslim says, never mind whether Hinduism is or is not the most wonderful religious vision, where can I learn something about the basic values, ideas, and practices of a Hindu way of life? That is a great lacuna of our systems of higher education, a lacuna that is shaped, to repeat, by our post-colonial inheritances relating to anxieties about studying and debating religion in the public square. Now, for many years, indeed for many decades, I have been studying the patterns of relations across Hindu and Muslim borderlines in the region of Bengal and more generally North India. On the one hand, there are various shared forms of cultural affiliation across Hindu and Muslim social contexts in Bengal. On the other hand, there are some deep fault lines across these contexts shaped by socioeconomic asymmetry and social hierarchy. Some years ago, I published a book on this topic titled The Hindu Self and Its Muslim Neighbors, where I argue that across the last 6 centuries, Hindu-Muslim relations in Bengal have been modulated and shaped by a spectrum of intellectual, socio-economic, and political factors. Various patterns of friendship and antagonism have been generated at dynamic intersections between Hindu and Muslim representations of one another and shifts across socio-economic contexts. So the characterization of relations between Hindus and Muslims in terms either of an undiluted hostility or an unfragmented peace is historically inaccurate, for these relations have been formed by a shifting array of socio-economic and socio-political variables. Now, all this is the complexity at the grassroots. Suppose we look at Hindus and Muslims from a symbolic height of 20,000 feet, 40,000 feet, what do we see? And here are some hypotheses. When I was a young boy, I grew up in Guwahati, which is in Assam, and I lived in a very religiously diverse environment with Muslim and Roman Catholic friends, acquaintances, and various other people. And these hypotheses that I'm going to read out to you now are partly based on my childhood experiences and partly based on years of reflections on these topics. So across Islamic visions, there are 2 scriptural strands which are sometimes sharply opposed to each other, and sometimes they coexist in an uneasy tension in the same text, tradition, or teacher. The first is what I have called here the anxiety of influence. This is a deep worry that a participation in the cultures of India will result in a departure from the narrow and straight path of truth. The second is what I've called here the will to hospitality, the confident stance that a participation in Indic cultures is precisely an expression of commitment to the narrow and straight path of truth. Likewise, across Hindu traditions, there are 2 scriptural strands which are sometimes sharply opposed to each other, and sometimes they coexist in an uneasy tension in the same text, tradition, or teacher. The first is what I've called here the vision of austerity. Certain codifications of the Hindu Dharma characterize the non-Indic outsider as a hostile enemy or as a resident alien. Thus, the second century Sanskrit text Manusmriti declares the range of the spotted antelope is the land fit for sacrifice, Bali or Yajna. Beyond that is the land of the Mleccha, that is the foreigner with whom people of Dharma must not have any exchanges. The second is what I call the vision of abundance. The Hindu Dharma, which is not completely codifiable, is said to be the universal umbrella that encompasses the whole world under its spiritual canopy. Thus, the motto of the university established by Rabindranath Tagore, Vishwa Bharati in Kolkata declares, where the whole world makes a home in a single nest. Now, in an ideal world, a Hindu vision of abundance would live happily alongside an Islamic and a Muslim will to hospitality. However, in real-world circumstances, a Hindu vision of austerity has often collided with an Islamic anxiety of influence. Why is it that Hindus and Muslims alternately speak the language of anxiety or hospitality, or the language of abundance or of austerity? More specifically, why do some Hindus speak with the Manusmriti's language of an anxious prohibition, and why do some Hindus speak with the language of Rabindranath Tagore's warm reception? Here is one relatively straightforward answer. We are shaped by a range of variables, such as our psychological temperament, our childhood upbringing, our social location, and so on. Now, against this complex backdrop, what may we do to, to, to initiate or to reinforce forms of dialogical friendship and outreach across Hindu and Muslim borderlines. To begin with, we face a daunting challenge. The burden of history is filled with various incidents of hostility or indifference, where these different incidents have been expressions of long-range structures of material deprivation. Human history is the complex narrative of how mortal human beings compete for scarce resources, where this competition is shaped by the language of outsider or insider. Depending on the language being invoked, region, nation-state, caste, class, race, or religion, we may find ourselves on the wrong side, or if we are sometimes lucky, the right side of a divide. On this occasion, because I have only around 55 minutes, I will not discuss the structures of material deprivation that have shaped Hindu-Muslim relations. Let me instead highlight the crucial point that the generative motor of much hostility across Hindu and Muslim borderlines stems simply from mutual misunderstanding. More generally, I will now highlight certain methodological problems relating to study a different religious tradition, that is, a religious tradition that is not your own home tradition. Perhaps the most famous problem in what is called the scholarly study of religion is the insider-outsider problem. And in its most basic formulation, the problem is such: we are usually brought up as members of one specific religious group or community or social formation. And again, we do not jump in and out of these groups. We do not usually say things like, let me try out a bit of Christianity on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. I will sample a few dimensions of Islam on Thursday, and for the rest of the week, I will be a religious Hindu. We do not talk like this usually. Now, let's say one morning we decide to study world religions at university. Is that even going to be possible? Someone may say, unless you participate in a religious system, you can never properly understand it from the outside as a casual onlooker. And as we will see today, the key concept is participation. And let's say that on one understanding of the concept of participation, you cannot participate in more than one religious system at the same time. Therefore, if you are a member of one religious system, you cannot study or properly understand a different religious tradition. Now let me reformulate the problem in the form of 3 questions. So the first question is there a way to define the concept of religion in such a way that all human beings can agree that when they encounter a certain phenomenon X, they are in the presence of religion? And the second sub-question is, suppose the answer to the first question is in the affirmative, and you are yourself religious, what is involved in trying to understand a different religious tradition? And the third sub-question is, suppose the answer to the first question is in the affirmative, but you are not yourself religious. Can you possibly understand a different religious tradition? So what I'm now going to do is take you through these 3 sub-questions one by one. So let's start with the first sub-question. Delineating or defining the concept of religion happens to be one of the most debated themes in the scholarly study of religion. And you will be, or you may be, surprised by the number of books, articles, and encyclopedias that have been compiled by people over the last 100 years as they have tried to define the term religion. Now, how does, in general, one define a certain concept X? First, one tries to draw some boundary lines of distinction between what is X and what is not X. So if I'm trying to define a cow, C-O-W, I start by saying a cow is an animal, which highlights the point that cow is not a non-sentient object. However, this definition is too broad, for even a cat is an animal. Second, therefore, one tries to fine-tune the definition. I may say something like this: a cow is an animal which is 4-footed, gives milk, and so on. However, one should take care not to make the definition too precise by providing qualifications to to the so on, such as white in color. Because some cows, as we know, are light brown or gray in color. So the definition should not be too broad, nor should it be too precise. Now, while such a method often works with physical objects, such as cows and chairs and tables, it does not work so neatly for concepts such as religion, science, culture, justice, democracy, and so on. So let us look at this definition of religion. So according to the first definition you see on the slide, a religion is a set of beliefs and practices which are centered around the worship of superhuman or supernatural beings. Various religious systems or spiritual systems fit this definition. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, devotional forms of Hinduism, and so on, are indeed centered around the worship of different gods and goddesses, or a supreme god beyond all these deities, and these are not physical objects. However, systems of belief and practice, spiritual and religious, such as Mahayana Buddhism, present an interesting case for this definition, for while Buddhist practice also involves meditation on certain superhuman beings, these superhuman beings are regarded as ultimately unreal. Therefore, religion 1, the first definition you see there, is too precise because it cannot cover the case of Mahayana Buddhism, which some people may regard as a religious system. Suppose in response, we develop the following definition, which also you see on the handout, on the slide. Religion 2, what is that? A set of beliefs and practices which are centered around whatever is a matter of ultimate concern. And by that phrase, ultimate concern, we mean one central unifying focus which gives meaning to, organizes, and shapes your life. Thus, even if you eat vanilla ice cream every morning for breakfast, this ice cream is not yet a matter of ultimate concern because it does not structure every other aspect of your existence. But the Christian God structures and maintains, according to Christians, their whole life on earth. Therefore, Jesus Christ is a matter of ultimate concern from a Christian point of view. However, this definition could be too broad, and we can think of all kinds of enterprises which can become included under the rubric of religion. Consider the case of a young man who declares that football is his religion, or buying fast cars is his religion, or even having a scholarly career is his religion. So there is nothing in the formal concept of ultimate concern which can allow us to distinguish between certain beliefs and practices which we regard as religious and some other beliefs and practices which we do not wish to include under the category of religion. Now, some scholars, keeping in mind all these problems relating to defining religion, have argued that instead of looking for a fixed set of conditions, we should look for some general overlapping patterns or characteristics. That is, rather than saying something is a religion if and only if that religion has some universal conditions A, B, and C, we should rather say something is a religion if that object or that phenomenon has one or more of certain contextual features A, B, C, D, and E. That is to say, we should look for what are called family resemblances across religions. You may not look exactly like your father, but you may have the color of your father's eyes and the color of your mother's hair. And here is the example. Christianity is the set of beliefs and practices centered around the worship of one supreme creator God who has become incarnate in Jesus the Christ. Buddhism, as we know, has no such beliefs in creator divinities, and yet Buddhism shares with Christianity certain common contextual features, a set of canonical scriptures, a historical founder, modes of spiritual practices, the practice of pilgrimage, and so on. So while keeping in mind the vast differences between Christianity and Buddhism, we can nevertheless say that Buddhism shares certain quote-unquote religious characteristics with Christianity. So all of that is for the first question, what is religion? So to go back to this slide. Let's now move to the second question. So the second question is what you see there. So let us now grant that certain entities, such as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and so on, are quote-unquote religious. Let us also suppose that you yourself are religious. That is to say, you are a follower of a particular tradition X. And that is where the problem I'm discussing today, the problem of the insider-outsider begins to trouble us. And why is that so? If you are an insider of one religious tradition, is it going to be possible for you to develop a proper, sensitive comprehension or understanding of a different religious tradition? Why? And let us take this sub-question apart by focusing on three keywords. Number one, insider, number two, understanding, and number three, proper. So, let me see if I find it here. Yes, so those are the three questions that we are now going to look at. So the three sub-questions to our second sub-question are, what makes one individual, say John, an insider of one religious tradition, say Christianity or Islam or Hinduism? Number two, what does it mean to say that John, who is an insider of one religious system, has understood another religious system? Why? And the third one, when can we say that John has properly or comprehensively understood a different religious system? Why? Okay, so let's start with the first question. What makes John an insider of Christianity or Islam or Hinduism? Often we think that simply because an individual is born into a religious community, he is automatically also an insider. To a certain extent, this evaluation of the insider status of an individual can be justified on the grounds that such an individual has absorbed, as it were, what I call the background radiation of that religious community from the first day. To understand the concept of background radiation, think about how a lot of what we know cannot be precisely articulated in words, conceptual categories, or logical arguments. For many people in this room, perhaps Urdu or Hindi is your first language. For as long as you remember, you have always spoken Urdu or Hindi. If someone were to ask you specific questions relating to the grammar of Urdu or Hindi, you may be able to give the right answer, even without knowing why that is the right answer. And this dimension of knowledge is sometimes called tacit knowledge, and is indicated by the slogan, we know more than what we think we know. So for instance, if you are born into a family of practicing Muslims, there will be vast areas of beliefs, experiences, and subjectivities that you would have absorbed from the atmosphere around you, even unthinkingly, even unself-consciously. However, it would be mistaken to propose a strong conceptual equivalence between the two statements. John is born into a family of practicing Christians, and John is an insider to Christianity. And why is that so? Many religious systems distinguish between the mode of active engagement and the mode of passive immersion, and they tend to use the label or the category of an insider only for individuals who are religious in the first mode, that is the mode of concrete and active engagement. Thus, if John happens to be a Roman Catholic who was baptized as an infant but has never participated in forms of Christian living for a long period of time, his status as an insider may be denied by some denominations of Christianity which demand a much more active commitment to Christianity. Here is a different problem. Precisely what do we mean by Christianity and by Islam and by Hinduism and by Buddhism? Religious universes such as Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism are not static blocks, but are dynamic, evolving tapestries which are constantly being shaped, rewritten, reformed, and sometimes even reconstructed by their followers in concrete socio-historical environments. Think of the differences across Christian styles of living in these three locations. So the three locations you see on this slide. Number one is small English countryside village, a city in Nigeria, and a town in South India. While all these Christians do share a common doctrinal core that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and through faith in Jesus Christ, one receives the gift of salvation, the three forms of Christianity you will see in these three locations can have very distinctive flavors. Let's say the style of Christianity found in South India includes certain forms of yoga, while the style of Christianity found in the village somewhere in the south of England does not accept any form of yogic contemplation as part of Christian practice. Also, let's say John is a Christian who happens to believe that the basic message of Christianity is not only compatible with, but even requires for its full expression certain types of yogic experience. Now the question is John properly an insider to Christianity, or is he an outsider to Christianity? The answer depends partly on his socio-historical location. In the town in South India, he may be regarded as an insider to Christianity, and in the countryside village in England, he might instead be denounced as an outsider. Likewise, what if a Muslim, call her Amina, declares that the cultivation of certain yogic exercises has helped her to understand the significance of the principle of Tawhid. Now, is she, properly speaking, an insider to Islam, or is she not properly speaking an insider to Islam? And if you move from Bareilly to Deoband to Lucknow, you may find a whole spectrum of answers to this question. So the basic point is that the boundary line between insider and outsider of a religious system can shift depending on the socio-cultural environment within which it is located. So that is the first sub-question. Now let's move to the second sub-question. What does it mean to say that John, who is an insider to one religious system, Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity, has begun to understand another religious system? So next, consider the second sub-question. Since John has lived his entire life within forms of Christian belief and practice, is it possible for him to begin to understand a different religious system, whether it is Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism? Let us first ask, how does one understand X anyway, never mind religion? So to begin to understand X, you have to know what X is. And in particular, if X is a spatio-temporal object, then what we try to do, we try to place it under a certain category. So we look at a chair or an apple, and we place it under the category of fruit or furniture. A second way of understanding X is to place X against a background of causes and effects. Just thus, to understand a disease is to offer a diagnosis and trace its causal antecedents. However, when it comes to the spiritual reality or the focus that religions deal with, Jesus Christ, Vishnu, Allah, and so on, neither of these two methods will work, at least not in a straightforward manner. Why? Because according to religious philosophers, the divine reality is not one kind of thing who or what can be placed within a category. Rather, the divine reality goes beyond every human category. Again, the divine reality, according to these philosophers, cannot be placed within a network of causes and effects. Now, here is a third way of understanding, which is specifically related to understanding a human being, a human person. Some scholars have argued that understanding a human person is categorically different from understanding non-sentient beings like chairs and tables and apples. To understand a human being, you do not simply classify them as human being of type A or type B or type C, nor do you simply produce a causal account such as human being who is subject to these causal influences from the local environment. Rather, so goes the argument, to understand a human being is to develop a form of sympathetic participation or a sympathetic indwelling in that person. That is, you try to see, to the extent that it is possible, the world through their vision, the world through their eyes, and you try to walk a few miles in their shoes. So we cultivate this sympathetic indwelling of a person when we try to understand their actions from their own internal subjective point of view. Now, in the light of that comment, let us look at this particular verse in the Hebrew Bible, and then let's look at this particular image, which reads as, the verse in the Hebrew Bible, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below." Now, the question of what is an image is one of the great flashpoints of debate in Hindu-Muslim relations. And as it was pointed out, I've published an article in the blog of Zaituna College, and there is a lot more detail in that blog article. But here I will only give you a very brief summary. So what you see here is an image or an icon of the Hindu goddess Durga killing a demon. And Durga is worshipped as the supreme cosmic energy, Shakti, in a certain strand of devotional Hinduism. If you speak to Hindus who are familiar with the philosophical, theological basis of this form of worship, they will tell you that it is not the case that a 5 feet tall image made of clay, earth, and wood contains the whole of divinity. Rather, this 5 feet tall image is venerated as a temporary habitation for, let's say, 5 days or 7 days of divine power. And this image is treated as a pointer to the divine reality that somehow lies beyond the image. Therefore, at the end of that duration of 5 days or 7 days, the image will be ritually immersed in water to reinforce the claim that one should not confuse that particular image with the fullness of the divine reality. Now, the point of this brief exercise is not to suggest that Muslims and Christians should start worshipping Durga as divine, not at all, but that what may seem initially very strange and alien and odd can become less so once we begin to understand the worldview of a worshipper of Durga from the perspective of the worshipper. Now, here is a more straightforward case. What about a Christian, John, who's trying to develop a sympathetic indwelling of Muslim prayer? Because Christians and Muslims, as we know, share certain scriptural beliefs relating to prophets such as Moses and Abraham, and the theological theme of monotheism, a Christian can actively respond, sympathetically respond to various aspects of Muslim prayer, even if the Christian is not quite sure whether Christians and Muslims are indeed praying to the same God. However, suppose we move far beyond the boundaries of what are nowadays called the Abrahamic traditions, and here is a very different example I'm going to give you. Let's say John, who is again a Christian, meets a group of people who tell him that they are going to sacrifice a goat to please the sky god, who is very angry. And the angry sky god has driven the rain god to some distant place. Now, John, who is a practicing Christian, believes ultimately that there is only one creator God who is the source of goodness, value, and significance. So let's put this question to John. What are some possibilities that John can try out if he wants to try to make sense of what these people are really saying? First option, John can say that the sky god and the rain god are not really out there as realities. They are nothing but the hallucinations of a group of people. The second option is this: the sky god and the rain god are not hallucinations, but not proper ways in which people who have not yet heard about Jesus Christ are trying to approach the one true God. Now, note what has happened here. In both cases, John has understood the beliefs of the community in a certain sense. Why? He is able to place their gods in a certain conceptual scheme, or he is able to provide a causal description of their beliefs. Now comes the really crucial question for our third sub-question. Because John has applied a certain vocabulary, namely God who is Jesus Christ, because John has applied a certain vocabulary which the people do not themselves use, is this a case of true understanding? To repeat, since John is speaking in terms of Jesus Christ, a concept that these insiders do not themselves use, can we say that John has understood the beliefs and the practices of the community? And that brings us to the third sub-question. When can John be said to have properly, sensitively, and adequately understood why? So according to one answer, John has properly understood why only if he phrases his understanding of why in terms of concepts that people in why themselves use. According to the second answer, John may in certain cases, precisely to understand why, may have to employ concepts that people in why do not use. So let me give you one concrete example which will highlight the basic debate. Suppose you are traveling through the middle of North America in the year 1758, it's a long time ago, and you come across a community where 3 women are going to be burned as witches. Now you wish to try to understand why they believe in such a thing. How would you go about doing this? According to the first answer, you must buy into the whole network of beliefs relating to spirits, relating to supernatural phenomena, and so on. Let's use the term ontology, which roughly means the kinds of basic things that you believe populate the universe. So if your ontology does not include all these spirits and supernatural phenomena, then according to the first answer, you cannot properly understand what is going on there. According to the second answer, it is not necessary to buy into the whole set of beliefs and practices of that community. You may provide a causal explanation of this type, the causal explanation that those people themselves do not provide. So here is a causal explanation you may provide. When individuals out there in the American wild feel threatened by the presence of hostile forces, wild animals, inclement weather, they begin to internalize those fears and they project those fears outwards onto specific kinds of beings. And these Americans already have certain European socio-cultural beliefs about how women in particular can become the location of some sinister forces. Therefore, at certain times of the year, especially winter, when life is very harsh and precarious, they begin to project all kinds of hardship to the sinister designs of women whom they categorize as witches. So the key debate is whether understanding a community, a religious community or a social group requires the active adoption of the concepts of that community itself or not. And that brings me finally to the very third question. That is the very third question that I said I will start with. So the third question now is, if you are yourself not religious, what does it mean to understand a different religious system? Now, every religious system has a conceptual or a cognitive core. It makes certain truth claims, as they're called, about the nature of reality and the nature of human existence. Some typical truth claims are, God exists, God became incarnate in Jesus Christ, there is no God but Allah, but the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is God's messenger, Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, and so on. So now our third question for you is, do you yourself have to be religious to understand a particular religious tradition? And by now we know that the answer turns centrally on the different meanings of the concept of understanding. So to quickly repeat the two answers I gave you, according to the first answer, if you are not yourself religious and you do not share certain concepts with the community you are studying, then you cannot truly understand that community. Therefore, the only way to understand a religious community is to become a full insider yourself. That is to say, you have to go native. According to the second answer noted above, membership of a religious community is not a necessary precondition for understanding that community. Therefore, to understand the religious community, you do not have to become a fully involved member of this community. Okay. Now, suppose we try a middle path between these two views, which is to say that we will bracket out or quote-unquote suspend our presuppositions. Consider this as an example of this process of bracketing out. You are one day introduced to your friend called Margaret, let's call her Margaret, who is dressed in a slightly peculiar way. And at once you start generating evaluations such as, oh, Margaret must be somebody very bad for whatever reason. She is trying so hard to be cool and so on. Now, what this strategy tells us is to bracket out or put away all such preconceptions about what Margaret's style of dressing has to say about Margaret as a human being. So what about trying out this strategy in trying to understand a different religious community? We would suspend or bracket out our presuppositions and our preconceptions. The key question is whether this suspension is psychologically possible. To a certain extent, the cultivation of such a stance is a matter of scholarly training in the study of religion. Let's say we are not religious in any straightforward sense, and yet let's say we may be deeply interested in understanding how a particular religious tradition such as Islam or Christianity is deeply interrelated with various social, political, and economic forces in human civilization. If that is so, you don't necessarily have to accept various kinds of Islamic or Hindu or Christian beliefs about the nature of the divine and the structure of the cosmos. You can think in this way: let me ground the Christian or the Hindu or the Islamic claim that God exists, and the way to learn about God is through the pathway of this particular scripture. Let me now go out into the real world and see how Muslims or Christians live out and practice these beliefs. So let me understand how these beliefs they are worked out in the fine grain of their everyday lives. Now, there is, however, a fundamental problem with this whole business of suspending things. Suppose someone argues as follows: the reason why, in order to understand a religious system, you cannot be somebody who belongs to that system. You cannot be an insider. Because only somebody who is not an insider can develop a sensitive, unbiased, impartial, dispassionate account of the religion. If you are an insider, you are too much fully involved with the religion in its multiple dimensions. Now, there is a significant grain of truth in that claim. Certain aspects of a religious system may not be clearly noticed by their own followers, simply because they live their religion every day on a daily basis, and these aspects may have become invisible to them. However, and if that is so, if you are not an insider, you can draw the attention of the people who are insiders to those aspects. But suppose an insider were to respond as follows: what you refer to as a bias is, according to us, a necessary precondition of understanding a religious system. Unless you are deeply involved at various levels, cognitive, emotional, and experiential, you will not properly understand the richly layered dimensions of our religious system. After all, a lover properly understands the beloved precisely because the lover is deeply involved in the beloved. And it is true that sometimes love is blind. It is equally true that sometimes it is love that makes you see in the first place. So let us now draw to a conclusion. Throughout this lecture, as you may have noticed, I have been raising questions, and in the process of trying to answer one question, I have only raised yet more questions. And to some extent, this is how the scholarly study of religion proceeds. Not that we do not want to give answers, but that we would first want to know what the question is that we are trying to answer. Here is a story about a Christian and somebody who does not believe in God, who were once debating the question whether God exists, without first arriving at some form of consensus on how the concept of God is going to be used. And after 1 hour of debate, the person who does not believe in God said to the Christian, if that is what you mean by God, that is what I mean by Satan, the devil. Now here are 3 takeaway themes from this lecture. Oh, sorry, yes. Yes. So the first takeaway theme, as it were, from the lecture is that the boundary line between the insider and the outsider is often dynamic. As we have seen, somebody who is an insider and somebody who is an outsider depends on the local context. And what that means is that even if a certain community makes the claim, you have to be one of us to truly understand us, one will have to put the question in return, precisely which one of you, the men or the women, and if the men, which men, if the women, which women. As they say, when you are in Rome, do as the Romans do. But what if you realize that the Romans themselves do not quite agree on what to do, on which gods and goddesses to worship? And consider this quotation from Samuel Heilmann. Yes, you see that quotation, who is a sociologist and a practicing Orthodox Jew. So he says, I live in 2 worlds. In one world, I am attached to this eternal yesterday, a timeless faith and ritual. In that world, I am an Orthodox Jew. In my different world, there is little, if any attachment to religion or sacred practice. In that domain, I am a university professor of sociology. So to put it bluntly, if we were to go and ask Mr. Heilmann or Professor Heilmann, are you feeling religious right now? He may say, it depends on the time of the day. I mean, just to put it very bluntly. Now, the second takeaway, which follows from the first one, is that there are degrees of insiderness and outsiderness. So as we have seen, whether you're an insider or an outsider can, on some occasions, I don't mean to say all the time, depends on, is sometimes a matter of degree. Now again, go back to our friend John, who is nominally a Christian, and consider someone called Buddhadasa, who is a Zen Buddhist monk who has been studying Christianity for many decades. And he has participated in some Christian rituals and spent time in Roman Catholic monasteries. So once again, who is more of an insider? Is it John or is it Buddhadasa? While John may have some deeper immersion in layers of tacit knowledge, Buddhadasa may have a more sensitive, historically informed, and critical understanding of some aspects of Christianity. And the third takeaway for us today, religious understanding often requires a significant measure of critical empathy or critical sympathy. Now the phrase critical sympathy or critical empathy is seemingly paradoxical. How can you be both critical and empathetic? How can you be both critical and sympathetic? So let me note that when scholars, and I'm sure you know this too, when scholars use the term critical, it does not quite mean what it means outside scholarly circles. To be critical of X outside scholarly circles is simply trying to show that people are stupid and ignorant. However, a critical approach to the study of religion, a critical approach to the study of A and B and C means various things, such as tracing the historical antecedents of X, or trying to understand how X is related to the everyday life of a community, or examining whether X is conceptually coherent, and so on. So the somewhat paradoxical claim is that you can be properly critical in the scholarly sense of the term critical. You can be properly critical of something only if you have some measure of sympathy towards that thing. Because if you do not have some measure of sympathy or empathy towards that thing, how can you even begin to situate it in a historical condition, in a historical trajectory? So when I say cultivate some measure of empathy, I say some measure, which is a slightly vague term, and that is deliberately so because there is no fixed number that I can give you, 5.8 or 3.2. Precisely how much of empathy or sympathy one needs to develop for a particular case will vary from case to case. So on that note, I will conclude. I hope I have not tired you too much by speaking for almost 1 hour, I think so now, that you have found this discussion meaningful, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. But I think first there will be a response. Yes.